And this was the first science in the virtual pub that I experienced, was a talk about this wonderful woman who discovered some awesome fossils. And there is a movie out about her now, but my parents told me it has nothing to do with the science part of anything.
Yeah,
but you can get these from the Museum of the Earth, from their store.
yes.
Got some of the fun organisms she found on it.
Yes. And now we are live on YouTube. So, and I am going to start screen sharing again with a different set of slides. So welcome to Science in the Virtual Pub. I am Don Haas, your host for Science in the Virtual and Actual Pub. And tonight we have a climate change education panel. And if my co-hosts can watch the participants coming in and admit folks as they come, if I am not paying attention, that is helpful. So welcome to our climate change education panel. And trying to do the slideshow here. Here we go. As I said, I'm Don Haas, the Director of Teacher Programming at the Paleontological Research Institution, which is in Ithaca, New York, though I am actually in Amherst, New York, just outside of Buffalo. And these are our panelists tonight. And I think I'll have you quickly just go across the slide here, have you introduce yourself just by name and what you do. So Kelly, you want to start us off?
Sure, I'm Kelly Grabowski, and I live in Western New York. I've taught in a range of places, earth science, for a little over 17 years, but I now am the STEM coordinator at our regional Board of Cooperational Educational Services, and that's in Cattaraugus and Allegheny counties.
Yes, and Kelly also coordinated the Western New York Youth Climate Action Summit for 4 or 5 years, something like that. Ada, you want to go next? 4.
Hi, my name's Ada Bastudo. I'm a student at Amherst Central High School.
And Mike, you want to go next?
Yeah, Mike Jabot. I'm a professor of science education at the State University of New York in Fredonia, about an hour south of Buffalo.
And Drew.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. My name is Drew Biter, and I teach 8th grade social studies, modern American history at Springville Middle School. And I also am the director of the Academy for Human Rights, which trains teachers and students on a variety of cutting edge issues of our time, including the warming of the planet. And Don, thanks for staging tonight.
Yes, and thanks for joining us. And Nellie, you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Nellie. Any pronouns are okay. I'm currently a senior at Amherst Central High School in Amherst, New York, just outside of Buffalo. And next year I'll be going to SUNY Purchase.
And you've met me already. And Adam, you want to round us out?
Sure. Thanks, Don. My name's Adam Gallwitzer. I teach high school science at Chautauqua Lake High School. We're about 70 minutes southwest of Buffalo.
All right. Thank you all for joining us tonight. A quote that I like to kick us off here: the most damaging words in the English language are, "It's always been done that way." And I think we need to think pretty hard about that. And it's from Grace Hopper, who I think was the first female admiral, if I remember my history correctly. We have changed our plans a little bit for tonight, and we'll acknowledge the mass shootings and talk about some of connections between that and climate change and all sorts of things, and have an interdisciplinary flavor to tonight. And that's a really, really important idea that I think we'll all touch on an awful lot of the time. When there's educator programming for climate change, it's focused on the science classroom, and it is not just a science problem by any stretch. So we are keenly aware of that, and the Buffalo shooter in particular had some interesting thoughts, problematic thoughts on responding to climate change and other environmental threats that are deeply, deeply troubling. And before we dig into that, I've asked all of the presenters to come up with a challenge and a hope. And I'll kick us off by sharing my challenge is that a huge number of indicators show that we are marching headlong into disaster. And that's pretty depressing. My one slide answer to that is that we have always believed that we were marching headlong into disaster. And so far, at least on the global scale, we've always been wrong. And that does give me some hope. But it's important to note that we've been wrong because when the evidence is credible that we're marching headlong into disaster, we get to work. I am cautiously optimistic that we are doing that now. And there are a variety of efforts underway to address that. And I think it's really important to recognize that trends often reverse. And I am hopeful that the trends related to mass shootings in the United States is a thing that is going to reverse sometime very soon. But again, we need to get to work on that to make that happen. Next up is Kelly. Kelly, take it away.
So the challenge I identified was living in a multi-crisis world. That's nothing new, but I feel like maybe with media the way it is and just being more connected to information, the different crises are flying at us at a rapid pace. I hope that it's just a perception thing and it's not actual, that there's more and more crises going on, but I do some work in social and racial justice outside of my climate work. And I feel like I'm constantly pinging back and forth all the crises that I work on. So I'm losing steam. I feel isolated, especially because of the pandemic. And where I live, so geographically, I am pretty isolated. So I imagine this is also happening with others. So that's my challenge. Go ahead and turn the slide. But my hope is that climate change can be a unifying theme. So the original climate summit, this picture here is from the third climate summit of 4. Our fourth one was virtual in 2020. And originally when we got the idea to do this, one of the thoughts in my mind was I wanted to bring youth together from across the region of Western New York. We span from rural areas to urban areas and of course the suburban in between. And I wanted to bring youth together that didn't understand each other necessarily, but may find some common ground in this unifying theme of environmental issues and climate change. And so I know that we saw students from the inner city exchanging Snapchat names, numbers with each other when we brought them together, and they are probably still holding on to those friendships since then. And so I think we can kind of work on multiple facets of these crises by talking about climate change with youth and bringing them together, which brings me to an even bigger hope. And Don already knows this, but we've been working on bringing back the climate summit, and I officially just got an okay from my boss's boss that they want to bring it to our region and our BOCES. So we will be able to have some financial backing to reproduce the climate summit that we had before. So I'm really excited about that.
I am very excited too. Yeah, and I will note too an important, I noted being depressed or it being depressing work, but I believe the most effective way to deal with the depression and anxiety associated with learning about climate change is to work on the problem. And I think that's a really, really important idea. Nellie, you want to go next?
Hello. So my challenge is that a lot of a lot of people, not just students, although obviously I see it amongst my classmates, people don't understand the complete reach of the climate crisis, and they only learn about it in school in science class, and sometimes only in like middle school or like earth science, and like it's not really talked about in other science classes even. And so it almost feels like it's not real because we don't see it in our history classes or anything else. And I think it's dangerous to it's almost like we're saying like, oh yeah, we teach climate change, whatever, but it doesn't really reach the students because they don't know where in life they'll be affected by climate change, and they don't understand how big of a problem it is outside of just global warming or whatever they see outside of school, which is sometimes very, 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 very wrong.
Yeah, and I will note too that one of the reasons I asked Nellie is because I know her climate education in school has been disappointing, to say the least, and I think it's important to hear those voices. So here's Nellie's solution slide.
Yes, so New Jersey has approved standards that will incorporate climate education across all of their curriculum. And like, that's not just, one more class or whatever, but it's like almost like all classes in the school will have in some way climate education, which is just so great. And unfortunately, it's not happening yet, but I think it's next year or the year after that it'll go into effect. And Buffalo Public Schools are also bringing in a climate change elective, which obviously when we do talk about climate in class, whether it be earth science or another science class, it's just like a unit, or maybe it's a unit and then later it is mentioned in another lesson or something like that. And so to have an entire course dedicated to climate change is a huge step forward. So it's very exciting.
Yes, and that'll be in every Buffalo public high school next year, a half credit hour or a half credit course. Next up is Drew.
Hi, everyone, again. And the gentleman on the screen, you're all familiar with him, but the quote that you see that education and catastrophe is, I think, at the heart of what we're doing here or trying to do as educators. And, this really came home to me around 3 years ago. For most of my professional career, I really focused on Holocaust education and genocide prevention. And it seemed to me to be the problem of all problems. And then I was introduced to climate. And then I realized there's going to be such a massive climate migration and competition for resources that's going to increase genocide around. Second half of my career, I'd be better suited to focus on an even larger problem than human hatred and what causes it, but climate. Now, here's the good news. What Nellie just shared, I think, is at the heart of our future as educators. We, when Sputnik was launched in 1957, there was a national freakout over science curriculum. And for the next 2 to 3 years, schools around the country, like yours and mine, doubled down on science education. And guess what? It worked. 10 years later, we had a person on the moon. We had robust science education that not only put us into the outer atmosphere, but also created microwave ovens and a whole other mess of technology that we rely upon that came from that Sputnik reaction in classrooms. So what keeps me, out of bed in the morning is the potential to train non-science educators in the importance of climate. And to do that, I'd just like to start off with a brief anecdote that for those of you who happen to be grandparents on the screen, you know what will happen to you if you have the audacity to mistakenly throw out, not that you would, and not recycle a plastic can or a water bottle, because you know your 5-year-old grandchild will just open up a can of whoop ass and get in your face and say, Grandma, why aren't you recycling? Well, that didn't happen by accident. It happened because of state laws. And it happened because of kindergarten teachers teaching about recycling, even though they weren't scientists. And that's what we really need right now. And laws in the New York State legislature that would make teaching about climate important and required in the K-12 curriculum. Now, that's a monumental step, because I love science educators and I want to sort of secretly be one. But in order for us to go anywhere, we need to train the future voters who are going to put pressure on our elected officials to do something. And that means climate's got to be taught in social studies classes, because that's where social change is taught. It's got to be taught in elementary rooms. Cli-Fi has to be taught in our English classrooms. And of course, let's not forget about language arts and what's happening to the warming of the planet in South America and in Francophone Africa, you name it. It's a Sputnik-like moment right now for climate. And so to do that, I'm very hopeful that we can, flip the switch on training teachers. And Don, if you could transition into my next slide, please. I'm so happy that my colleague and friend, Nicole McLaughlin is on the phone, head of Eclipse for Erie County, because here in Buffalo on July 18th and 19th, the Academy for Human Rights, Erie 1, Erie 2 BOCES, and more importantly, Erie County and their Department of Environmental Planning are planning a 2-day climate event for teachers of all stripes from K to 12. And, we're all first and second year teachers here in climate studies. Science colleagues have, had this embedded in their curriculums for a long while. But the goal of this event is to give educators in Western New York both the knowledge and inspiration to know that, we need to bring this in all of our classrooms. And the good news is can be done right now with the standards that are there in social studies and English, especially with the new civic readiness seal for social studies. But I'm hopeful that if we train enough teachers, it'll take a lot of time, of course, we can eventually go into the nooks and crannies of classrooms and make this the issue of our time. And I'll end with this. As Ann Stagnos, one of our partners on the screen, the whole concept of Holocaust education, which she pioneered 30 to 40 years ago, was at one point not in the books. At one point, it was seen as somehow tangent and too esoteric and something that people would buy into. And now it's almost overtaught, which is, of course, a good thing. And I think if it could happen with Holocaust education, it could certainly happen with the most, compelling issue of our time. So I'm hoping that all our participants on the screen can pass news of this conference on. I'm pretty confident it's one of the first of its kind, if not the only type of interdisciplinary conference about climate and sustainability in the country. And I look forward to going live about this event with registration for only $25. Not only do you get to hear Don Haas in person, but one of the leading climatologists, Paul Hawken, who's going to be zooming in from California to limit his carbon footprint. And day 2 of the event, Nicole, I was hoping perhaps you could go live here in a second if you could, to talk about what the bus tour is going to be about. And I know I didn't prep you for this, but in the spirit of science in the pub, Nicole, I was wondering if you might be available to talk about where the bus tour is going. But if I don't hear from you in a second, I know that maybe you might even be off the call.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Drew. So this was Drew's brainchild or, love child, possibly, this climate teacher event. So we are going to take educators to Push Buffalo, which Push is People United for Sustainable Housing. Their headquarters is at School 77 on the west side. And they're going to give us an introduction to their work, which has a lot to do with environmental justice. And they work in clean energy and energy efficiency, weatherization, And so they're going to give us a tour of the neighborhood of the homes that they've worked on. And I've been on the tour before, and it just makes you feel so good about community in addition to clean energy and energy efficiency. So it's really inspiring and beautiful, and hopefully we'll have a beautiful day to do that. And we're also going to go to the Northland Training Center, which is a relatively new center that is training students for workforce development around clean energy. And they're putting in a microgrid with a large scale solar installation, which is really, unfortunately, just in the planning stages, but we'll be able to see their vision for that, and possibly Verity Parente, which is right down the street from there, which is a manufacturing facility that makes batteries for indoor manufacturing vehicles. So potentially looking at that, and a couple other surprises up our sleeve that I'll save for you when you sign up. Thanks, Drew.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks, Don.
Yep. Oops. There's Mike.
So just to piggyback off Drew and what others have said, you know, I think the greatest challenge we have in working with future teachers is they are convinced that climate and climate change is a controversial issue. So my goal is to help them realize that it's not in many ways. It's warming, it's us. The experts agree, there is not a disagreement about this. It's bad, but you know, the power that the great minds like Paul Hawken and Project Drawdown bring is that we can fix this. My goal, you know, we had this sort of long-term belief that there's no bad news before fifth grade. Well, there is plenty of room for empathy before fifth grade. And so my goal is to help them understand that unlike any other issue that they will, or topic that they will work on in their professional careers, climate is that bridge between science, people, and a development of empathy to the impact that our individual decisions have on others. I'm very, very hopeful. My students sort of joke in my Earth Systems class that if they get stuck on a test and they don't know what the cause is, just say climate, and there's a chance you'll get partial credit. And those same students in the methods class realize that as that they think about how they develop curriculum to go into their classrooms, that climate is really the central issue. There's always a connection back from the world outside their window to the world outside windows all around the world. So I'm very, very hopeful. I think we have our work cut out for us, but I think it's good work. Not all work is good work. I think this is good work. So I'm hopeful.
Thank you, Mike. And Ada.
So one of the things I wanted to talk about was mental health with climate change, because I think there are so many different things today that can affect mental health. And I think for me, especially, I've noticed climate change has been one of them, because a majority of the publicity that climate change gets is about the bad things that are happening. You know, the environments, ecosystems that are getting destroyed, species nearing extinction, things like that. And it makes me feel like I can't do anything. Like, oh, well, I used a reusable coffee cup, but that doesn't do anything if this ecosystem is getting destroyed. And I think that's affected my mental health and motivation to help make a change in climate change. And I think that needs to change the way that we view and publicize climate change and what's going on in the sustainability field as well. If you want to move on to the solution, I think. So I think the best solution is definitely stay informed, be aware of the big picture, but also don't let yourself be discouraged, you know, by this big thing that I'm also doing, because what you're doing is important as well, you know. And I think that you should also make sure to be educated and know about the good things that are going on, new advancements that are being made, because that gives you hope and inspiration and maybe even ideas on how to implement that where you live, if it's somewhere else.
Great, thank you. And Adam.
Thanks, Don. Yeah, when you asked for a challenge, the first one that came to mind was just that we will epically fail as a species, as a society, just as people. And I was saying in this slide, I don't really have this in other areas of my life, this fear of failure. And failure is just like setback. They're learning opportunities. I mean, we've heard all the lessons that can come from failure. But with this one issue, I sometimes wake up in the night and think we're going to fail because there's other areas that are almost as important that we're failing. So I'm like, well, why wouldn't we fail at this? This is what we do sometimes. We just fail. But I also know that we can't afford to fail. So once I move past that, on the days when I'm feeling brighter about it, I do feel some hope, and that a lot of that has to do with the work that I do as a teacher. So Don, if you could go forward a slide. The students that I teach, and this is a lot of hard work, to sort of get down to the commonalities within all this. So the district I teach in is in a part of New York State that's pretty conservative. A lot of the kids I teach, their parents don't even quote unquote believe in climate change. So we're starting from like negative whatever and trying to move forward from there. But once we get there, once we finally get down to what's happening, and again, covering the basics that Mike went over, and Kelly and I have done some work in the past where we start with climate change is real, we're causing it, and yes, we can do something about it. What gives me hope is that just about every student, I would even venture to say every student that leaves my classroom at the end of it, at the end of their time in high school, they want this challenge. Like they want to take it on, they want to persevere, and they want the fruits on the other side of it. So whether it's someone that has super educated parents and they want to become in academia and research this and feed out good research to help us figure this out, to a kid that lives on a farm that wants a job at the other end of his, for his life, and wants to work on infrastructure that's going to protect us from climate change. Everyone that leaves the classes will vote for someone that will do something about climate change. What they end up realizing through the course of several discussions and conversations and a lot of instructional times, that the worst thing that could happen is that you do nothing, and that our leaders do nothing. And that becomes intolerable to kids across the board, irrespective of where they fall in their political spectrum, or irrespective of where they fall demographically or socioeconomically. They realize that just sitting there doing nothing or having our leaders do nothing is inexcusable. So that gives me hope. That makes me feel like this is something that they want. Kids have told me they want this. They feel like it will define them as a generation, more so than some other things that are put in front of us, like consumption and other ideas. So that gives me hope. It really does.
Okay, great. And I'll note there's another climate change workshop this summer, face-to-face, August 18th and 19th at the Museum of the Earth in Ithaca. And there's a bit of info about it. It is 225 for folks in that BOCES region, and 247.50 if you're outside of that BOCES region. But in most cases, I think most cases, certainly in many cases, BOCES or your district will cover those costs. So that is another reason for hope. This is a sort of a rerun of a workshop that we did in 2019, which Drew attended. I don't think anybody else on the call was in that workshop, but updated for one thing with another thing that gives me hope rather, is the Deep Geothermal Heat Research Project at Cornell University, which is about to break ground next month, June 8th. They will start drilling a 2-mile deep hole with the goal of heating the campus, the Ithaca campus, with geothermal heat with no carbon emissions from that. And that would replace the natural gas heating system that's currently in place there, which uses 50% of the Ithaca campuses, or is responsible for 50% of the Ithaca campus's emissions. And once that very expensive hole is drilled, and actually a few of those holes are drilled, it will essentially be free heat. And that is really, really exciting. And I think one of the things to be optimistic about is that throughout history, we have seen that when we change energy sources, we change history. And I think we're on the cusp of doing that in very encouraging ways. We will see. And I think I'm going to stop screen sharing and open it up for questions. And actually, maybe we're a pretty small crowd tonight, which is a little disappointing, but a pretty small crowd, but that leaves lots of room for engagement. If folks want to introduce themselves, they can, I think, go ahead and do that. If they don't, that's okay too. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, I'm going to put Cindy on the spot because I know Cindy a little bit, and ask her to introduce herself. And I'm pleased that we got more than one social studies teacher in our session tonight. So Cindy, you want to introduce yourself?
Everyone, I'm Cindy Kramer, and I teach 8th grade US history in Ithaca, New York. And I've been working for a number of years on our district-wide green team, mostly stuck in reducing contamination in composting, but I've been doing some more work through some international or national contacts in my own thinking and working. I'm intrigued with getting to know Drew and everybody here, but how to integrate it into, I really want that interdisciplinary for all the reasons people said it's so important. And I actually have a meeting next week with a key central admin who's really excited to talk about curriculum. You know, instead of, we want to work on district practices and procedures, which is still a lot of room to grow as we continue to fund diesel buses and gas buses. But I really am excited to look at the curricular possibilities with civic action, policy, roots of how we got here. There's a lot of possibilities. So thanks for all the sharing tonight.
Thank you. And I won't force people to introduce themselves, but if other folks want to introduce themselves, I'll have you go ahead and do that. Does anyone else want to say who they are and what they're up to?
I'm Linda Burke. I teach. I live and teach in Northern Westchester, and I am a climate reality leader. And I belong to 2 climate reality chapters. One is Westchester and one is Hudson Valley. And Hudson Valley is trying very hard to develop a database of all the school districts in our area. And we want to try and go into the districts and get them to let us come and give the climate talk to their staff development, during staff development, to try to get literally everyone on board, because you're absolutely correct. This is not one discipline. My district is quite proactive in terms of its climate initiatives to the degree that we can, because we are, I don't want to call us rural because we're not compared to the rest of New York State, but the services that one normally thinks of associated with a more urban area, we actually don't have. We don't have gas lines. We don't have a lot of infrastructure. So we've got solar panels on the roof of the school. Our operations person has just put in these wonderful lights that are operated by solar and wind power in the parking lots. And we're actually generating energy from that to run at least the transportation building. So there is hope out there. And my students, I teach AP Environmental Science, and my students are, they always say, Dr. Burke, it's so depressing. And then we get to the end of the course and it's not so depressing anymore because we're giving them solutions. And they're very, very interested in being proactive and moving things forward. So if Climate Reality can help in any of this, Hudson Valley chapter is very anxious to meet with other educators.
Yes, and I'll note I'm at least members of the Facebook group for both the Central and Western New York chapters. And would anyone else like to introduce themselves? Nicole kind of did.
I'll jump in actually, because I'm on the board of the Western New York Climate Reality Project for Western New York. So, we're just a small group starting out. It's a wonderful group of really well-intended people, super smart people. So always looking for support there. So that's great, Linda, that you're doing that. So as Drew said, my name is Nicole McLaughlin, and I work for Erie County, and I run a program called Eclipse, which is Erie County Low Income Program for Sustainable Energy. And it's my dream job. I'm super fortunate to have fallen in this position. And it has to do with transitioning Erie County, Western New York to a clean energy economy quickly for all of the residents and small businesses, while prioritizing low-income residents to make sure that they're first in line to get the benefits of clean energy, such as guaranteed savings with community solar, for example. And we're looking into the vehicle of community choice aggregation with multiple municipalities in the region that would literally potentially turn us to clean energy overnight. So really exciting stuff. It's a 3-year program. It's really just got started. So that's why we're working with educators as well to spread information, to make sure people are understanding it and they're engaged and they're excited about the possibilities. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Would anyone else like to introduce themselves? And then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. And I'll note too that I just put in a link for a Google Doc that has a whole lot of different resources for teaching across the curriculum. That includes the New Jersey standards that Nellie mentioned, and I'll say a tiny bit more about that. They have the standards, I believe, in 8 different disciplines, and I've downloaded the PDFs and taken a little bit of a look at them and searched them all for the phrase climate change. The standards that mentioned that the least, used that phrase the least, was phys ed, which only used the term climate change 8 times in their standards, which I think is pretty remarkable. There's also in that list the position statement from the National Council of Teachers of English for teaching climate change in the English classroom, and a link for a book that they published on doing that. So there's some really interesting and I think pretty encouraging resources in that list, and includes driver's ed and all kinds of things. So feel free to dig into that, and we should add a slide or 2 at the end of the slide deck for pointing to resources, and remind me at the end, and I'll stick at least some of those in there. And of course, PRI has lots of resources as well, including, I'll note, the Teacher-Friendly Guide to Climate Change, which full text is available online. And I'm going to open it up and read David's comment there. Yes, welcome, David. Good to see you again. So David introduced himself there, and David and I have chatted a little bit before, and he is moving to Buffalo shortly to start at UB. And other questions, comments, things you want to talk about. And there, I did put some discussion, just a few discussion questions in the slide deck, but I think if either panelists or participants have questions, ask away.
I just want to note that this Climate Education Committee of the Hudson Valley Climate Reality Chapter had a meeting with the Jersey people, and they told us that it's great, they've got this curriculum, but there's no support for it. There's no And that there's no mechanism to support the teachers.
Yes.
And that's where it's going to break down. I hate to use that word, but that's where it has potential for not being implemented, is that teachers get afraid, right?
Yeah.
I ran a climate education, I ran a workshop on climate in my district, and some of the people who showed up thought I was talking about school climate, and there's a disconnect. Some people just don't get it.
Yeah, it's pretty disheartening, actually. Then I've searched around on the National Council, what's it called, the National Council for the Social Studies. Is that right, Drew? The big organization for social studies teachers, and I've searched around on their website for the term climate to see what they're doing, and it's more commonly used to talk about school climate than global climate. And I found that pretty disheartening, though they have published a few articles in a couple of their different journals on teaching about climate change. But I will confess that I am disheartened by what I see in the social studies community writ large, but encouraged by seeing Drew and Cindy.
It's horrible, and it's not, the word climate has not been tested on any of the state's American history exams or world history exams. And I haven't done any research, but I don't know about the AP history exams. You'd think with this being such a global issue, it would be front and center. But, I'm interested in how people, how are we lobbying? We're all solidly interconnected here. And, Cindy and Linda, it's nice to meet you. But how can we put some serious pressure on Albany, because these education bills are, to use a sports metaphor, they're close to crossing the goal line, but, we certainly need to give them a nudge. And, I'd like to network and to see how we could do that, in a really uniform way. And Linda, I think that what's happening in New Jersey is, when you look at the history curriculums, it's disappointing, but it's not a deal breaker, because laws are passed. It takes a few years for them to trickle down. And then, you get more lobbying, and it happened with Holocaust education over time. And we need to really do it much quicker here, obviously. But, it amplifies the point of teacher training here. And so to me, that what's happening in New Jersey is sort of a normal downturn, but then it goes up, and I found too, I haven't, and I'm not embarrassed to say this, because of COVID, I had to pare down my curriculum. So I didn't teach climate in 2020 and 2021. And the good news for me is that 2 years ago, there were active 13-year-old deniers. And because of the problems that we see around the planet, I didn't hear any deniers this year. I just heard what I'll call implementers. Mr. Biter, how am I going to, go to an electric tractor when diesel prices are through the roof, and my father can't even, pay for that. But there's no one saying this didn't exist, and it was just liberal bullshit. It was serious people, people taking it seriously. So hopefully that will start to allow the politics to take traction and allow, the BOCES network to get behind this as well. And I know they're eager to, but a law would certainly, push them in that direction.
Yeah, and I'll just a couple of things about, a couple of things. The New Jersey, the PRI's climate team, which is myself, Rob Ross, Ingrid Zabel, and Alexandra Moore, who are also the authors of the Teacher-Friendly Guide to Climate Change. We had a meeting a week and a half ago with the president and president-elect of the New Jersey Science Teachers Association about working with them on climate professional development. And they obviously are both science teachers, but I think they are the ones who initially brought up bringing in teachers from across the curriculum for the professional development that we're trying to figure out how to pay for. But I think we're going to pull off at least something. So that's point one. And as I think Nicole can probably say more than I can, the Erie County Environmental Management, or the Erie County Climate Action Plan, includes teachers and students, includes roles for teachers and students, and Erie County is not unique in that. We at PRI are also working with Prince George's County, Maryland, which is a very large district adjacent to DC, and they are working with their county's climate action plan to engage teachers and students in that. And I'm really encouraged about that. That is a huge district. It's got, I think, 27 high schools and 130,000 students, and they all take a course called a required high school course called Biogeochemical Systems that is largely about climate change. That's a required high school course, and we are working with them both on that course and the redesign of their environmental science courses, where we're also working with the county there to plug in teachers and students to being engaged in the work on the climate action plan. And I see Richard and Barbara have unmasked themselves. Richard or Barbara, whoever posted the comment about the New Republic article, do you want to say a word about that? Or do you want to remain silent? Okay. We will let you go either way, but thank you for the link. Can
I jump in? I was just going to say that I think when we were talking just a minute ago about potential policy laws for curricular integration in New York State that are kind of sitting at committee level,
right.
Maybe the best, I know when I do some action stuff with the students that they can do from their desk, because that's where they're going to do it sometimes, in writing municipal decision makers, identifying what's going on in their communities, because we have 9 different municipalities across our district. Hearing from students, we just had some students present their version of Green New Deal. It is a buzzword, I realize, but it has a lot of substance to it, and it looks differently in different places. But they presented that to the school board. They were very warmly received, but somewhat patronizing in terms of thank you so much, we'll do our best kind of thing. And they're going to follow up. This wasn't in my school, but there were some efforts across the school. So I think hearing from young people in terms of action is one way. Like people said, like, how can people here and other, coalesce to try to do some organizing in that way and get to students. I think it also gives them hope, as we're saying, for ourselves and for them, to take action, to write letters, to hear, because they speak from the heart. I mean, they do feel this is their future. It is their future. It's all of our futures. And they just go right for, the core of it. And I think I always hear administrators in our district and board members say, we want to hear from the students, that moves them at a different level. Mm-hmm. So maybe there's some potential there for us to do some student letter writing for those bills.
Yeah, and I'll note too, relatedly, and I'll see if I can find a link to this. One of my favorite educational research articles published in the last few years shows how kids can influence their parents' environmental decisions, and how daughters are particularly effective at teaching their dads things, which I can kind of attest to, and that's really encouraging. And I think one of my key messages in work with teachers and students is that the most important thing that you can do right now about climate change is talk about it, because not enough people are talking about it, and talk to people that you may not usually talk to about such things, and deputize your students as climate change educators and communicators. And I think that has really huge potential for changing the world.
Don, I was just going to, some really important things that I think have come out of sort of from 10,000 feet around our conversation. So, Linda's point, so we've made some mistakes of how we've handled this. I think one of the mistakes we did was we generally still don't celebrate successes very well, right? And so you take an issue that is really overwhelmingly depressing at times, right? But I think if we start to celebrate the changes that people are making, then I think you've given a roadmap or a model for people to do that. I think the other mistake that we've made in the past is we've questioned people's motives instead of being happy with the outcome.
Mhm.
So I would like all my neighbors to have put residential solar on their houses because it helps with climate change. But in the southern tier, the vast majority of those people have done it because it reduced their electric bill.
Right.
Okay, so I can get upset about that and say, oh, you should have done it for a different reason, or I can be excited that they've done it, right? So, I think I think to speak for the four of us that teach in the southern tier, we are really, we are bright blue dots in a sea of scarlet red in many ways around this issue. And I think maybe the other, there sometimes incremental change, right, is where it has to start. So Drew, to your point about the student asking about the cost of diesel to run a tractor, that's one of the areas I think I try to be honest with my students when they say, well, why do we do this? Well, right now we don't have great options to not do it, right? I mean, that's where I tell them that's why we need you to roll up your sleeves, right? And let's figure out a solution for an agricultural system that's unfortunately very, very reliant on fossil fuels, right? We have to somehow do that. So I just think that I thank everybody for the things that they've shared, because those are the messages that we need to give to students. Otherwise, they are going to throw their hands up. I think we would be throwing our hands up if we hadn't come to realize that we can really make a difference. So.
Mike, you bring up such a great point. One of my favorite resources is Drawdown, which Drew had alluded to, Paul Hawkins speaking at our teacher training, but he puts farmers at the forefront of climate solutions, which is super empowering. Like, most likely your students don't know that they're the potential solution, or at least a big part of it. And farmers are, historically super creative and amazing problem solvers. So they're really well suited for this type of thing. So
as a former dairy farmer, they're also incredibly frugal, right? So if there's a way, it's kind of how we pay the bills. No, Nicole, it's amazing. And I use agriculture, at least local agriculture, as an example of the central role that climate plays in our lives. So we have a huge issue with runoff from farm fields, right? Causing algal blooms, all that. And people get very upset with the farmers. And I said, as a former farmer, we never did that. You don't put something on the field in hopes that it'll wash off, right? But the reason why it's happening is that we get gully washers now. We don't get precipitation. And I think that's where maybe to Drew's point about not having deniers in the classroom is because it's really hard to deny that our weather, right, our long-term weather, our climate has shifted, right? And so that's important. And drawdown is maybe the best resource, at least for the kind of work that I do, right? And giving positive solutions. You can do these little things, you total them up, and look what happened, right? So.
Yeah, it's really encouraging, and
really great.
If you're not familiar with it, I invite you to explore around. And there are also aspects of it that are not intuitive. That
right.
Educating women and girls around the world is one of the most effective climate change solutions, for example. It's because of lots of reasons, but I think that's interesting and encouraging. So lots of things to dig in there, and almost says hello.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Mike. Sometimes letting our perceptions of what's happening get in the way of like some common decency things, like asking questions. I can just share an anecdote from the small town I live in. They just approved for a big solar farm to be built. But during the pandemic, every time I check the board minutes, they denied it. Every time it came up, they denied, the town board denied it, especially the town supervisor was denying it. And I had a perception of who this guy was and why he was denying it. And I thought, this son of a bitch doesn't want renewables in our town because we're just like a farming town. It's probably politically not advantageous for him to do this. Meanwhile, there's wind turbines going up on all the towns around us. So I ran into him at Envirothon, actually. And I was surprised to see him there. And I sort of reintroduced myself to him because I hadn't seen him since before the pandemic. So, oh yeah, I remember you a little bit. And I said, I saw you that the town passed this solar farm project. He says, yeah, of course. And I said, but when I was looking at the minutes, it kept being denied. And he said, well, yeah, of course. I was pulling out for a better deal from the solar company. And I said, oh. He's like, that's my job. I was like, I just assumed you were blocking it because you didn't want it here because it wasn't advantageous to you politically. He's like, no. And I said, oh, okay. He's like, you could have asked.
Yeah.
So there's a reminder sometimes.
Other questions, thoughts, comments? Did I see Nellie's hand go up? Or?
I don't think we've actually discussed the connection of climate to the shootings yet, if people are up for that.
Yeah.
Relevant, although obviously all of this is relevant.
Right. Yeah, it's important. So the Buffalo shooter identified as an eco-fascist and was in a very, very twisted way trying to address part of what he was doing, was trying to address environmental degradation and climate change by killing people, so there would be less people to damage the environment. And that is a really, really scary and I believe growing set of beliefs that teachers should be very, well, I was going to say very careful with talking about problems related to overpopulation. I think they should not do that. And I'll put in a link, a couple of links related to that. You can read this first one is an interview with Joe Henderson, who is a good friend and former earth science teacher who's now a professor of environmental studies at Paul Smith's College in the Adirondacks, talking specifically about the connections of the Buffalo shooter to these, what I regard as very, very twisted beliefs. And I invited him to join us tonight, but it's his son's, I believe, 7th birthday tonight. So he's otherwise engaged. But it's a deeply problematic, and I think, like I said, growing belief in the extreme, certain sectors of extremism in America and around the world. Actually, it's not just an American problem.
Can I just speak to this really quickly? Because I read this article earlier when Don shared it with us this morning, and I realized that students in my classes would say things like, oh, well, environmentalism or climate change is a population problem. We have too many people on Earth. And I would almost agree with them because it's really like consumerism. But in this article, and I really encourage you to read it and then share it with teachers that teach about environmental issues and climate change, because I think it's hidden when students say like little things like it's overpopulation and we need to, people are bad and people are abusing the earth. Sometimes their minds may go down this rabbit hole and you don't even realize. Would have had no idea that they were thinking in this way, where it's like we need to get rid of people in order to solve this problem. So definitely take a look at it and share it with teachers.
Mm-hmm. Other comments, thoughts on that? And I'll note, for those that are that aren't Western New Yorkers, I am sitting right now 4 miles from that supermarket. It is, I live on the edge of Buffalo, so there are many supermarkets within that 4 mile radius, but that supermarket was 4 miles away from here. So, and I think the shooting in Texas yesterday and the fact that we've had, I don't remember how many mass shootings already this year. If you think it can't happen here, wherever here happens to be, well, I don't think that's the case, unfortunately.
Yeah, and without, having read this manifesto, I think that I don't want to say it makes sense, but it kind of makes sense how this kid ended up, becoming an eco-fascist and having that kind of mindset, because it is, it feels very doomed when we talk about climate change, not just in school, because honestly, in school, we don't talk about it very in depth. But like in the media and stuff, we want to scare people, but we want to scare them into saving the planet, not scare them into like thinking there is no way to save it. And there are some people who do that better than others, and sometimes it's just kind of depends on the teachers you get and depends on where you are and the people you surround yourselves with. But it's tough, and I think that's another reason that the interdisciplinary methods are beneficial, is that you just see the climate crisis from different perspectives, and maybe it will just feel less like the apocalypse, or at least maybe it'll feel more like an apocalypse movie where you get to save the world instead of just watch it end.
Yeah, and picking up on an important point that Nellie raised, that sort of scaring people strategically. There are a lot of important facets to that I've thought quite a bit about and read quite a bit about and talked with teachers and students quite a bit about, that if you are honest in your climate change education, it's terrifying and you need to be honest. And if you're not honest, students will see through that and dismiss you. So that's not what you want. But you also don't want to leave people just a crying heap on the floor. So thinking about how to, I'm not even sure about developing hope, but developing courage as part of your educational efforts, I think is really, really important. And, we've got to get busy, and we've obviously got to get busy not only on climate change, but on mass shooting related issues, which from my perception means figuring out how to get less guns, or get guns out of people's hands. And there are parallel struggles with those issues that are interesting, and honesty is fundamentally required, but honesty coupled with compassion and developing the will to act, and recognizing that dealing with anxiety and fear and depression, as I said earlier, just about the best way to do that is to get active on the problem, on working on the problem. And I invite my fellow panelists and the other folks in the room to respond to those thoughts. And I think I know everybody in the room, sort of.
I just want to jump in and say that where I went this morning when we started talking about it in class was to the Parkland students. and thinking about how they really created a national movement in response to their experience. And I think in some ways, like Kelly said earlier, like we all know there's multi-issues of crisis. And I think that's overwhelming for all of us and students as well. And then it's also a focus shift because now it's like, oh, where should I put my focus? And the more we can make those connections, I mean, it's a big framework, but I think so that I know that helped me in high school way back, like to see the interconnections, then it's not like juggling all of it individually, but you actually see them as so much a part of a whole system. And it might make it more manageable. And also for those of us that really want to raise awareness and action around climate crisis, maybe it can stay up there and not keep going up and down depending on all the different immediate issues. People want to be safe and secure first and deal with fear, but how we keep climate action up there has to show the connections. I think it will serve that and support that as well.
Cindy, I agree. And, the any climate unit to me, no matter what discipline, needs to end with some type of baby steps with action. Otherwise, it's going to create cynicism. And this was the same with genocide education and Holocaust education. If you just roll out, okay, here's the Holocaust and here's Rwanda and throw in your other genocides, kids are going to want to commit suicide. But if you give them some baby steps for schools, and someone mentioned it, okay, let's create a lunchtime focus group. Let's analyze the amount of gallons of gas that our buses use every day, how much taxpayers could save. And then the kids make a presentation in front of the school board. I mean, that type of thing, not only it gives the student body hope, but it also cultivates leaders that are going to replace us. And all of us had a moment where some teacher trusted us at a younger age. So that type of thing can't be underestimated because it's our secret fairy dust for the future. And, and it's something that I got to keep reminding myself about is it takes extra time, takes those, lunchtime hours, of course, but it can be done. And I think the ramifications are really positive.
Yeah, and I put in the chat the term multi-solving is relevant here, which means addressing multiple problems with one solution. And Drew mentioned diesel buses, and well, electric buses are better in a wide variety of ways, and involves multi-solving. In the long term, they are less expensive, though they're more expensive to buy. Maintenance issues are considerably less for electric vehicles, and I've got an electric vehicle 30 feet that way or something in my garage, but it's not just about cost, it's also about health and climate, and it's not just about climate change. If you stand behind a diesel bus, that's not very pleasant at all. And so there are health issues associated with that. I believe it's now illegal for buses to idle in front of the school, but that was a change just a few years ago, which was multi-solving again, both dealing with air pollution for health reasons and for climate change reasons. And electric buses, I think, have a lot to say about that. And other kinds of changes, like making communities more bikeable and walkable, also has the benefit of getting to know your neighbors, so you're less likely to shoot them. And ways that we can make our communities more bikeable and walkable have all kinds of benefits, not just climate change benefits. You end up being thinner because you walk more, and healthier because you walk more or ride your bike or whatever, and you know your neighbors, so your community is stronger in a variety of ways. And maybe you can get rid of your car and use that space for something else, and on and on and on. So thinking about how to multi-solve, I think, is a pretty important paradigm shift. And again, very interdisciplinary.
Yeah, on that interdisciplinary note, Don, and I know we're sort of preaching to the choir, to everyone that's on this the Zoom, but I was made aware of the link between eco-fascism and climate change about a year ago because my cousin clued me in on it. She's smarter than me, and she emailed me from her office in Seattle and was like, "Hey, did you know about this?" and sent me a couple of resources. So then I started to pay a little closer attention to it. But one of the things that I've done year in and year out is show a map of consumption, around the world. And of course, like we're right near the top. And I just assumed that my students were taking from that, like, we need to consume less. But when I started to ask follow-up questions about it, the students who were seeing the map differently, as I drilled down a little bit, had a supremacy issue, where they felt like we don't need to consume less. We have a right to our consumption, and the rest of the world needs to sort of adjust to that. And that I wish I had time to unravel all of that in the science classroom, but I just don't. And that's where I need the Drew Biders and the Cindy Kramers. And that's like where I need social studies. And I know you guys do that kind of work, and I'm not suggesting for a second that you don't, but this is where drawing the direct line from climate to supremacy, and how we could be doing that in a science classroom while the kids then go to social studies and they can be hearing it again in a social studies classroom is so important. And Cindy, you had mentioned interconnectivity. Students that I feel like are the furthest off from this understanding are also the furthest off from understanding their interconnectivity to the rest of everybody else.
Yeah, and I'll note too that Katie Worth, who was an investigative journalist for Frontline, PBS Frontline, wrote a book called Miseducation, How Climate Change is Taught in America. And she did a session with us in December, which I'll try and find the link for that in a minute, where one of the things that she writes about in that book is the growing divide between red and blue states and rural and urban schools on not just climate change, but a range of issues in both the sciences and across the curriculum. Critical race theory, for example, or not, and actually that's the wrong label to use, how race is addressed in the classroom. It's a great book, and it was a great session that she did for us in December. And like I said, I will find the link for that in just a moment. Other questions? Well, I can take this up.
I just want to talk about the climate summit again really quickly. So by our probably second year, we had realized we didn't just want students that were good in science. I think initially that's how we started. We reached out to science teachers that we knew, and we said, tell your students about this, invite them. And we want the best and brightest scientists, going out knowing about climate change. And I think it was our second year, we realized we wanted the best artists and the best social studies students. We wanted them all. We wanted the leaders who were going to be able to come in, learn something about climate change, and go back to their schools and turnkey what they learned, basically. So the interdisciplinary piece was not lost on us. And the other thing I wanted to say is, once we get the ball rolling for the climate summit that is hopefully going to come out of CA BOCES, I will be hitting everybody up that's on this call to come in and do something, run a workshop, talk about the interdisciplinary pieces of it. But I hope to see you again soon, and hopefully in person then.
I think it's great that you mentioned that, because like from my own experience, I've not in the climate summit stuff, but Challenge to Change is a anti-racist club at my school, and we do summits every year except for this year. But generally every year there's a summit with Western New York schools, and it was inspired by Rock to Change in Rochester. And I remember, like, my first year that I went, and it had only been going on like 3 years maybe before that. And different schools will like host each year. And I remember that at our school, it was like we put something out and contacted the students who had like been to the meetings before, because we actually meet like relatively regularly. At other schools, it's just the summit. They don't really have the club. But we found out that the other schools invited students to come to this summit on race based on like teacher recommendations and like honor students and stuff like that. It was like based on their grades. And the reason that this came up was because we were sitting there in this debrief meeting with just our school, and we were like, wow, a lot of those students were white, which, you know, it's good for them, for white students to come and learn, obviously, but like in the club at my school, I was one of only like 2 white students in the club. And, you know, when everyone else is white, like there's not going to be so much learning going on. And it's just important to think about, like, in all types of events, and especially in talking about climate, like, where did we get these people? You know, who are we talking to? Are we preaching to the choir? Are we getting different perspectives? I think that's a huge problem in the conversation about climate, because it even if it's like, you know, you think that you've got a diverse group of students, you might not. You have to think harder and realize, like, we totally left out this group, or, you know, this perspective. And it's just something that sometimes it's easy to not notice, but can really affect the future.
Yeah, and I will hasten to add that it has not escaped me that we are an all-white group.
Yes, me as well.
Yes, that was an error on my part. Oops.
Don, you mentioned, thanks, Nellie. Don, you mentioned the New Jersey curriculum, the new one. Does anybody have a quick link of that they could drop in the chat?
Yeah, that's linked from the interdisciplinary doc I put in earlier, which I've got open. So
Thanks.
Find it. And you can keep discussing amongst yourself while I find that link. Or be quiet. We are coming up to an hour and a half together, which has been delightful.
I guess I am curious. So, like, for the teachers in the room, which is, I think, the majority of people here, would you say, as far as you know, like, especially if you're like the science teachers, would you say that you think your peers in your department also teach climate change as like a big part of the curriculum, or are you more alone in that sense? Because at my high school, it is not a huge part of the curriculum, and like I go to a relatively, you know, obviously no politics, public school, whatever, but like it's relatively a progressive school near a city, and makes me a little nervous to think about, you know, places in like central New York.
My department is very supportive, and at least in the biology teachers make an effort. They do a Climate Friday every week, and Data Monday. But it's does it translate out of the science department or to the physics people? Not so much, except when it deals with electric vehicles. They're very pro electric vehicles. So if it falls within their discipline, yes, they do support it.
I like that Climate Friday. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's so many resources that you can utilize, right? The New York Times does a climate forward on Fridays, and it's kind of a natural current events thing too.
Worked at several schools, and usually I was probably the only teacher teaching about climate change. But one school in particular, where Drew's from, I don't think any of the science teachers were teaching about it, but I don't know how I did, but I dug through the teachers and I found there were some global studies teachers that were teaching about it. And I think it's because they knew Drew. So that was hopeful though. That was super, because usually I feel like one of the biggest anchors is the social studies teachers. One of the schools I worked at, the social studies teacher let the students debate between if climate change was happening or not. And this was probably a decade ago. And the valedictorian was on the side of it's not. And she was great at digging up bad research and debating it. And so she won the debate that it's not happening. And that was really discouraging. So I used to categorize social studies teachers as like on the other side, but when I got to Hamburg, they were actually teaching it. So that was awesome. The economics teacher, especially.
Yeah, and I'll note that Katie Worth's book, which I put in the chat too, has a vignette about a student hearing about climate change from a science teacher and then going down the hall and hearing pretty much the exact opposite from a social studies teacher. And that is not all that uncommon, although I will also note that I know some science teachers who are climate change deniers. So it's not just it's not a simple division between groups. And it's very, very important to note that most American science teachers are like most Americans and hold a range of beliefs about all the things. And you can see that play out across the curriculum in various ways.
Who's new to our school shared with me last week. She says, I really wish I could teach about climate change. It's just not in our curriculum. She's an earth science 8th grade teacher and physical. And I think she felt really bound by it. So the power of at least getting it explicitly in there and then building the supports to make it happen is, we know, so important, because I could hear, so that's what she wanted to do, but she needs to see it written there. I also, in Ithaca, which I know people make a lot of assumptions about what people think, and we have quite the range of political perspectives in general and also on climate change. So we have a tech teacher who I really like a lot, but he and I really disagree respectfully on climate. And when I say tech, it's sort of the, not the computer tech, although he does, that it's the new name for shop. And he showed them the movie last month, Michael Moore's movie, Planet of the Humans. And they were just so like overwhelmed by the dissonance they felt watching it. I hadn't watched it and recently did. And it's been critiqued by some of the leading thinkers like Bill McKibben. But I think that's another thing for students, is that they put trust in us as teachers. And when their teachers teach different perspectives on something that I'm going to say I'm going to teach as a fact and as a science, no longer, like Kelly said, it's no longer a debate. It is, and it's more like, what are we going to do about it? So I think that's challenging for students, is the just different perspectives. We have a social studies teacher that just said to a student last week that climate change is a conspiracy. And she's in our Student Climate Action Club, so she shared that. She has a very strong perspective through her family, but she's like, wow, is that, are you allowed to say that as a teacher? So that was a really interesting comment as well.
Yeah, and on the topic of debating, I think debating about things where there is a scientific consensus is pretty problematic, and a debate can deepen convictions more than understandings. And I think that in general, we want to move from debate to discussion. I think the way debate plays out on the national stage is pretty ineffective. And I think when we bring it down to the classroom level, unless you think about it very, very carefully and are very planful about how to approach it and are not debating things that really shouldn't be debated. I mean, the science of climate change, there are, of course, some details that are debatable, but the main thrust of, you know, what Mike had on his slide, that, you know, it's real, it's us, it's a big problem. I don't remember if that's exactly what the words were, but more or less. And experts agree that it's real, it's us, it's a big problem. And that is just not a thing where you can do a productive classroom debate as a general rule.
And that photo that was in my slide is the shirt I was going to wear. And on the back are 5 sites to go to. These are 5 reliable sources to go and find. I was going to share, you know, we did slow myself down here. We did a mini model climate summit, like the model UN.
Mm-hmm.
And to continue the praise of our social studies colleagues that are on here, that was really one of the most dramatic things I have ever seen. You know, students' understanding of both sort of the role of the country they were assigned, but also the connection between, you know, we talk a lot about that, you know, we're high producers of carbon, right? And we don't pay the price that countries that produce, you know, it's that real shift, right?
Yeah.
Countries that are producing the least amount of carbon are seeing the greatest impact from climate change. And so, you know, I mean, I think those kinds of, and it completely changed the conversation within that building about this. I think there were some reluctant, you know, I'm always reluctant to throw a teacher under the bus, but I think there were some people that maybe weren't as open about talking about climate and then listen to these kids talk about this experience, right? And it was all because they couldn't do Model UN. That was the only reason. That was my only foot in the door. Model UN got canceled. They wanted to do something. I said, let's do a model climate summit. I have the materials. Let's do it. So we could piggyback, Kelly, on your maybe do that in January as a precursor, an advertisement for the climate summit, the real climate summit.
Yeah, we actually, even our first year, talked about doing like a Model UN mock workshop piece. We just felt like it was going to take more than just the hour that we had set aside for a workshop. So
it takes more than an hour. Yep.
So we would love to incorporate it somehow, though.
Takes way more than an hour to get it set up.
I would like to also just add in terms of, you know, students and the hesitation to talk about climate in class. You know, a lot of people see it as a politicized issue because, I mean, it has become a politicized issue, even though it really should not be. And I think that there are some people, like at least at my school, where, you know, we're in a pretty well-educated, you know, district and all that. Most people, I think, believe in climate change. They just, for some reason, like, they just don't want to look into it enough to really understand it. Like, they're not really climate deniers, but they don't understand what's going on because they choose to ignore the facts because to them, you know, it's like a leftist thing. And like, they just see it as like, well, the same people who believe in this believe in all these other things that I disagree with, so it must be bad. And it's hard to obviously change that mindset once it exists, but school is the time to do that. And, you know, I know teachers aren't supposed to get political. Like today, I had one teacher get probably the most political I've ever heard a teacher, because he was talking about the shooting yesterday. He was one of two of my teachers to, or maybe three, to acknowledge it at all. And, you know, it's one of those things where it's like, I think people, some teachers might be nervous to start talking about climate change because it feels political, but it really shouldn't be. And it is something that should be taught because it is facts. Like, you don't have to say, like, you know, these are the policies I support, but there are so many just straight facts that that we just don't get, and make it feel even more polarizing because it's only outside of school that we get any sort of education on climate change. And so then in that outside of school, that's where it is politicized. And we don't get that nonpartisan basis to, you know, to actually form your own opinions on. It's all just what you get from your family and friends and whatnot, which is once again dangerous.
I'll nuance that maybe a little bit and say that politics should deal with things that matter. Climate change matters, so climate change is political. But I agree with everything else Nellie just said. So
yeah, well, everything is politics, really.
Everything is
every little thing.
No, Nellie knows.
And Nellie, I think the end around is using the word sustainability as much as we can.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's the spoonful of sugar that makes the medicine go down easier, and, you know, introducing it that way. And, you know, again, I labeled myself as a second year. I've been in the classroom 26 years, but I've been in the climate classroom 2 years. But the one lesson that I really want to produce is allowing my students, you know, to work on the solutions, that they're imperfect. And we have to meet our conservative brothers and sisters more than midway on this, because the implementation is where we're at right now. And it's hard, and it's going to take problem solving. And, you know, a few years ago, I might have reacted a little indignantly. Now, man, if I was born on a farm in the town of Concord, and my dad's livelihood and my livelihood depended on the price of diesel and buying a new electric, that's a big headache. And so I want to give my students opportunities to analyze those things, and, you know, what should be the government response. And, you know, but I think using the word sustainability is where we need to go, because it's so far it's not been politicized, and hopefully it'll never will be.
To spin off of like using different terms, one thing that I did as an earth science teacher, and I don't know if anyone is an earth science teacher or wants to share this with yours in your school. I taught climate change from a mass extinction perspective. So I started by, you know, teaching through the geologic timescale, hit on all the 5 big mass extinctions and what caused them, or what we think caused them, and how we know that. So the fossil record. And then I showed them data about the current mass extinction and how it's going faster than what has happened in the past. And so we kind of just would use the term like ecological disaster or mass extinction instead of climate change. But I would say, because the climate is changing, so eventually like that terminology worked in there, but that's the way I approached it, instead of like, okay, class, we're going to learn about climate change today. So it was easier to believe, I hate using that word, but the fact that it had already happened in the past, not to be confused with the fact that it has happened in the past, so that's just what's happening now. But the fact that it's happening faster now was also part of the lesson.
Yeah, and I will note that we are beyond an hour and a half now, which is longer than we generally go. And I put a couple of links, one to point to if you would like to make a donation to the Paleontological Research Institution to report this kind of, to support this kind of thing. There is a link there to do that. And the coming events page, which right now ends with this session, but soon we'll have the fall events listed. My hope is to have at least most of the fall events listed in the next few weeks. So look for that. I'm game to stay on if people want to keep chatting, but and there are a couple of folks who haven't said anything if they'd like to chime in. And I will also note, apologies to Barbara, that our schedule this year has been confusing with some sessions at 6 and some at 7:30. Next year, they will all be at 7 o'clock on the second and fourth Thursdays of the month to avoid having that confusing issue, and they will all be on Thursdays with no more Wednesday events. And as Kelly notes, it is recorded, and you can find that on PRI's YouTube channel, which is just our web address /YouTube, and it'll get you there. But I will also add a link to the recording on the events page in the next couple of days. And like I said, I'm game to stick around for a little while. If a lot of people want to stick around, I might pour myself another beer, but but whatever. What do you want to do?
I think I'm about ready to go because I have homework due tomorrow where I still have to go.
I endorse that.
I will just remind people, obviously a lot of links have been sent in the chat, and there is a feature to just save the chat instead of like trying to scramble and go back through and copy down the links that you want. You can just go to the little 3 dots and hit save chat, and it'll go to your computer.
Yeah, and I can actually I can save that file and link it from the events page for Science in the Pub too.
All right, well, I think I'm going to head out, but thank you all for having me, and
yes, thanks.
Great
Thanks
discussion.
to the panelists and the participants. Thank you one and all, and I can stick around for a bit anyway.
I hope to see you all again. Bye-bye.
bye.
Bye, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
It was a great discussion.
It was.
Yeah. So, seeing that you're all, participants in the last conference that's behind me here, we hope to go live with all this on Tuesday, and it's only going to be for $25, which is just a nominal fee just to give people skin in the game. And Kelly, if the Climate Action Summit is happening next year, I'd love to give you the microphone for a few minutes to talk about it. And, so let's talk more about that. And, seeing that climate, Don sort of, with his big shoulders sort of carries the ball for science teachers. I want to try to use our breakout sessions for ELA and STEM and social and things like that. But I'd love to see you there, and we're really excited about it. And we're hoping to make it an annual event and focus on a different part of climate studies. In the same way that Holocaust Ed focuses 1 year on propaganda, the next year on, hate speech, or the next year on, pick your historical theme. And the county is really charged up about it because they know that, they need to not only implement these policies, but teach them to taxpayers. So I'll look forward to being in touch. And, Don, Mike, hope you can, come up for it. And because we really think we got something important here. And you'll be pleased to know, Don, that last week I was in Washington, and it was in a small audience with the head of K-12 education, and he asked, what should we be doing? And I'm like, you need a mobile squad of master teachers teaching about climate. And he wrote it down at least. And everybody said, well, at least he wrote it down, but
well, if you got an in for me, I'm going to DC next month. I can pay a visit.
It was really amazing just to that's his title, head of K-12. But at any rate, thanks, Don. And it was nice to see everyone. And, I'll be in touch hopefully on Tuesday, or at the latest on Wednesday.
Great. Cool.
Good seeing you, Drew.
Yeah, good to see you again, Drew.
Yeah, good to see you all.
Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Good to
Bye,
see
Mike.
everybody.
Bye, Don.
Bye-bye.